You're watching Cheche live on Citizen TV. Today's guest, well, we had two guests, the Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Amina Mohammed, who's just left us, and the EU Ambassador, who's still with us, Ludwig Brie. And before the break, the Cabinet Secretary was thanking you for the grants the EU has given to Kenya. In the papers this morning, I think it's a Daily Nation, there's a grant for traffic. Tell us about that.
We have for a while been supporting road transport in Kenya and have done, I think, up to now some 2,000 kilometers. This is actually a last part of an ongoing funding program which aims to what we call draw the missing links in Nairobi. And it's in different parts of town where we try to remove bottlenecks in traffic so as to help decongest Nairobi. It's a 3.2 billion shilling program, if I'm not mistaken, and we are actually planning under our next funding program to tackle the urban congestion much more seriously.
Okay.
So, and I'm quite happy that we are in a situation to do that.
I'm sure Nairobians will thank you for that. But there's also more than 50 billion shillings coming Kenya's way over the next 7 years, 52 billion shillings to be exact. Break that down for us. What's it doing? How? Why?
I mentioned the funding tranches.
Yes.
Under the European Development Fund, the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament agree on long-term funding. So our funding from 2014 to 2020, 7 years, for Kenya amounts to 52 billion euros. And that amount will be spent on areas that we've been discussing with the government and where the government has the final say. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we also have our views to bring to the table. And what we will be looking at is agriculture, drought resilience, food security as one basket. Secondly, infrastructure, not just roads infrastructure, but also the energy infrastructure. And that might mean, feeding roads and things like that. And as I mentioned, the decongestion. And then thirdly, governance and devolution related issues, which is also, all these areas we're already busy in, and we've been busy for years on the agricultural part in particular. And I think it's been quite useful. I should add, all of this is grant money. I mean, people have a slight tendency to mix that up. Mm-hmm. We are increasingly moving in the roads infrastructure field to blending loans from our sister organization, the European Investment Bank, with grants, where we use the loan and we may use a grant to turn a concessional rate into a preferential rate.
How does that work?
There are different ways of doing it. We've just done it in the largest wind farm, Lake Turkana Wind Power, that we are funding, where we gave as European community 25 million euros, which have actually been used by the European Investment Bank and converted into preferential shares, which are then handed over to Lake Turkana Wind Power, and on which it has to pay an interest. It's quite a
Which is a private company?
These are quite, yes.
It's a private company.
It's a private company.
That is going to develop energy
it's been set up with the help of many different aid organizations and countries and private industry, and which is starting to add, over the coming years, 20% of energy, I think some 500 megawatts, if I'm not mistaken, to Kenya's grid.
Is that borrowing from the Chinese model?
I don't think so, because I don't think there's much by way of grants in the Chinese model, but the blending is important and is actually innovative, because what we are trying to do with our loan is to leverage that funding more. So you use your shillings, your euros more wisely.
Okay. There are grants within the Chinese system. But David, let me... Yes.
Yeah, I want to ask, how has the relations of the kind of funding systems changed over, if you track back? I mean, I know you haven't been here all the years, but has there been a change in terms of how you're dealing with the Kenya government from the Moi administration, the Kibaki administration, now to the Uhuru administration?
Yes.
In terms of...
Yes, there has been, and it goes in a way back to what we were discussing earlier. We also have in aid the whole international agreements on aid efficiency.
Yeah.
The Paris Declaration, followed by the Accra Declaration, followed by Busan, and it's ongoing. And in terms of aid efficiency today, we are working much more closely. First of all, we are basing our assistance on the priorities identified by the government in Vision 2030, MTP1, MTP2, etc. Secondly, we are working much more closely with other donors. So there is a very vibrant donor coordination group, donor partners group here in Kenya, composed of many of the ambassadors that you see around town. And there is a donor partnership forum which includes the government. And we've had a meeting which was attended by Deputy President Ruto a few months ago, late 2013, where we discuss these issues. And where we discuss how we are doing. And where government says you're not doing well enough here and there and there.
Right.
And I'm encouraging Treasury to you know, keep our feet to the fire.
The monies you're mentioning.
Because I think it's quite important that we are forced to coordinate more closely.
Right.
I sometimes feel, and I'm sure this is something you like, is that we are imposing different procedures on a government that still has limited capacity. And we should stop doing that. And that is where, you know, the aid efficiency really comes in.
Yeah, the monies you're talking about, are they factored into the budget that, say, was just released the other day? Or
yes, some grant money is on budget, some grant money is, some aid money is off budget. And there's quite a discussion going on about this, actually. The question is how you interpret Article 209 of the Constitution, how you read the Public Finance Management Act of a few years back. So, and we are very keen that anything that we undertake in Kenya, also those donors who do not work directly through the government, we are quite unique in that as European Union, they want to make sure that the government endorses the project they're undertaking.
Okay.
I mean, think of the USA, USAID, which has a fantastic program in all the counties to deal with the President's emergency program for HIV and AIDS relief. And it's just one aspect.
Ambassador, you talk about governments with limited capacity, and going back to civil society, the response might be that the capacity is limited because there's not enough investment. You know, mediocrity is tolerated. So at what point, when you make allowances for limited capacity, how do you balance between sovereign countries and a paternalistic attitude, which, you know, excuses away mediocrity?
In aid management, there is no space for a paternalistic attitude. And this goes back to the dialogue. Are we speaking to Kenya? No, we're speaking with Kenya.
Or at Kenya.
Or at Kenya?
Yeah,
no, we're speaking with Kenya.
Yeah.
It's not a parent-child relation. And that is where I think really, coming back to your question, the donor-recipient discourse and the donor-recipient relation has changed fundamentally. I also think that sometimes it goes overboard, that there is a sort of an anticipation, you know, you owe us so much money in any case. And I think that's exaggerated. But the way in which this happened, I think, is quite good. And, you know, Cabinet Secretary of the Treasury, Rotich, will be signing that National Indicative Program with Commissioner Peebalgs, I think tomorrow, if today is Wednesday, yes.
Today is Wednesday.
Then,
okay.
And I think that's perfect. You know, there are at this moment on the EU side 39 national indicative programs that have been approved formally by the various institutions. They represent 9 billion euros, all of it grant money. Well, there are not many partners that can sit around the table and say,
we have to wind up because
no, you're going to put in a negative.
A different one, completely different one. There's something called carbon trade.
Excuse me?
Carbon trade.
Carbon trade to do with climate change.
Through climate. How are we doing? In
Carbon trade. I mean,
yes.
I must admit that I'm not particularly well read on the carbon trade, but I believe that increasingly we need to make sure that, and this is one of those trends, you know, diagonal issues, cross-cutting issues that we need to look at, to make sure that whatever we undertake is sustainable. This is something that is coming up next week also in the United Nations Environmental Assembly that has its first formal governing council, and I think that there will be other meetings with its executive director Achim Steiner. It's quite important, and it is quite important that we share what we are doing in Europe and what we have adopted with our various host countries to make sure that we are not sort of, undoing on the one side what we are doing on the other.
Right. We're winding up. We've got 4 minutes left so that we can move on to the football in Brazil. David, we've heard a lot from both the EU ambassador and before the cabinet secretary left us, a lot about trade, the global dynamics, what Africa's trying to get out of this, retooling of trade agreements. Are you optimistic? Given that what we've been talking about the EPA since 2007, if I'm not mistaken.
Earlier.
Are you optimistic that in July we will have these EPAs signed?
Well, let me first say I plead inability to make a decision on that. I mean, given the progress in the negotiations, from what I heard here, there are not too many issues outstanding to, lead to a failure, and I think it ought to, I think, to help us move forward, especially because in fact, when I hear Ambassador here talking about more loans to us, and there's a bit of, alarm at how high our debt is going, we should be very enthusiastic about opening up the trade agreement so that we can have more money to finance our development without resort to support and the gratuitous donations from the EU and other countries.
What about you, Mutegi? What do you reckon?
I read a lot of negative things about EPAs, and that many people saying don't sign. But from the explanation I have from the cabinet secretary and from the ambassador here, I think I'm positive that something nice is going to happen.
Do you think the negativity, the focus from the civil society is what's helped us get to this point where we've eliminated the sticking points and are coming out with more favorable?
I think so, because I think they have been hard. As you see, they have said they have 3 issues to resolve. It means, therefore, a lot of ground has been covered. I don't think it was a waste of time for people to say, don't touch them.
Right.
If I may, the EU has also, in the past months, put a fair amount of
so these are your last comments, because we're
wine.
Cutting into football time, which I think you want to...
Put water in its wine, meaning we have really, I think, tried to be as flexible as we can be. The Agriculture Commissioner has said we will make sure that no agricultural export subsidies will in any way, be benefiting the European Union in its exports to the East African community. As I mentioned earlier, we are not asking for consultation, we're asking for notification. It's a fundamental, you would be amazed how long negotiators can talk about this. It's depressing, actually.
Right. So in terms of your final thoughts, the optimism, you've referenced your EU Commissioner, Piebalgs. Are you confident that we will see an agreement in July?
Yes.
Excellent.
Without reservation.
Any final thoughts for Kenyans watching?
No, I mean, my deep thought and empathy is with Kenya these days, and as I reiterated earlier, I really hope that the disruptive political rhetoric will come to an end, and that we and Kenyan leadership on both sides of the aisle come to grips with the real issues which are on the table, and the cost of living, and the job opportunities, and obviously the insecurity are really the priority.
Europeans and Americans are not trying to sabotage Uhuru's government.
You saw that article in the Standard today. I really thank you for giving me an opportunity. Again,
very quickly.
Do you think there's a Western plot to undermine the Jubilee government?
Well,
we've had an election observation mission. We are fully in support of a process. I must say that the people who think that, and I think that a number of ambassadors should go out.
The people who think that go back to choices have consequences, which is what we were told
we
in the
need
run-up
to see
the
them with a number of ambassadors, and I think that's an initiative I should take, to say, guys, let's speak together and let's have an open conversation. Because what you're suggesting about a conspiracy theory is, just completely off the wall. It is nonsense.
They would also say that the heightened political rhetoric we're seeing is as a result of the opposition leader, former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, having gone and spent time in the U.S. and so possibly may have been, his renewed fervor, shall we say, is coming from that visit.
I think you're reading too much into that, frankly. From the contacts I've had with the U.S. ambassador here or otherwise, it was his free choice to spend some time. And also, from the conversations I've had with people on the government side, he has been keeping close contact with his colleagues.
You're very emphatic that we should tone down the rhetoric. How? There is a proposal for dialogue. How?
By accepting a process of dialogue, and I think by having a meeting, no question, and maybe the meeting should be more than tea at State House, but it should be less than something where you say if it has no, if we don't like it, it will have consequences.
Yes.
You can't say that. I'm awfully sorry. And by recognizing that you have a National Assembly, a Senate, and county assemblies, where normally on the floor you have that discord taking place between those who represent the executive and those who represent the opposition. I don't think that's too difficult. Kenya is a sophisticated country with huge potential, and it is to some extent held back by this poisonous rhetoric.
Right. So, well, thank you for your time, Ambassador Ludwig Briet. He's the EU ambassador to Kenya. We'll also thank our panelists, Mutegi Njau and David Makali. We had the Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Amina Mohammed, earlier, and we'd like to thank you all for participating in our conversation today. My name is Udwaka Nemo. Do have a great week.